Good afternoon, ladies. We missed some of you in lesson 2 of Romans part 4. This week we began chapter 12, did our observation worksheets, and hopefully you did your homework. If you hadn't got a chance to do it, at least read through chapter 12. There's so much there. In the next few weeks, we're really going to focus in on chapter 12. This past week, the very first word in chapter 12 is therefore. And a couple of different pastors that I've had said, if you see the word therefore, look around and see why it is there. So as we looked at the word therefore, we realized that Paul is reminding us of everything that Christ did for us with his sacrificial death on the cross, how he brought propitiation, he redeemed us, he justified us, he imputed righteousness to us. We're reconciled to God because of what he did. All of these things. And because of all these things that he did for us, he tells us, he says, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living and holy sacrifices. Living and holy sacrifices. That's really what the whole chapter is about. As I read through chapter 12 and did my observation worksheet, one of the things that I noticed in just reading through it the first time was all the do's and don'ts. And I'm not really much of a list maker, but as I read through those, I thought I really need to know what he's telling us to do and not to do. So if you did not make a list this week, I encourage you, pull your paper out, read back through it, and just write down every place he said do, write it down. The very first one he said do was to present your bodies as a living sacrifice. As we went through, there were a couple of them I missed, and some of the ladies in the class brought that to my attention. And so I think I have a more complete list of the things that Paul wants us to do as Christians. And then the second list that I made was do not. There were many things he told us to not do. Not be conformed to the world, not think too highly of ourselves, not to curse. Verse 11 was another one that I kind of missed a little bit. It said to not be lazy or not to lag in diligence. And so that's something to kind of think about it as you read back through this chapter. The very last one, of course, was do not be overcome by evil. We really enjoyed our discussion this week, and if you missed it, I so hate that you missed it, but come back next week. Pick your book up and let's get started studying. Another thing that the book, the chapter 12 in Romans is known for is the gifts. This is where one of the first places we see that God gives us spiritual gifts, or as verse 6 says, gifts of grace. And as we read through, we listed prophecy and service, teaching, exhortation, giving, leading, and mercy. These are some of the gifts this next week as we study verses 3 through 8. We're really going to focus in a little bit on these gifts and think about what else God has done for us. It's not that he just saved us and redeemed us and made us right with him. He is giving us gifts so that we can be this living sacrifice that he is asking us to be. We also looked at the word sacrifice and that there were two different kinds of sacrifice mentioned in the Old Testament, that there was reconciliation sacrifice, and that's what Christ did for us. He was our reconciliation. He paid and made the debt clear. But then there's also sacrifices of consecration. And if you were able to take the time to go back and look in Leviticus, you would see that consecration sacrifices were whole burnt offerings. The whole animal was burnt in the offering or used. On the tape, Kay gave a very graphic description of what they did to these burnt offerings. But they basically skinned them, opened them up, took their guts, even washed the guts, and then placed everything on the altar. And that made me think that as living sacrifices, God wants all of us. He wants not only our bodies and how we act, but he wants our mind, our emotions, and our spirits to be given over completely to him and to his service. I want to end today's lesson with you as we looked at them last night, I had pulled out several different translations of the very first 2 verses in Romans. And Romans 12, 1 and 2 in the New Living Translation reads like this. And so, dear brothers and sisters, I plead with you to give your bodies to God because of all He has done for you. Let them be living and holy sacrifice, the kind He will find acceptable. This is truly the way to worship Him. So worship begins as we give ourselves to Him and are pleasing in how we live. And verse 2 goes on to say, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. And I love that verse because God is changing us by the way we think. And the way He changes the way we think is when we spend time with Him in prayer and within study of His Word. Ladies, this week, enjoy your study of Romans chapter 3, verses 3 through 8. Vicki looks forward to seeing you next Wednesday morning in her class, and I'm looking forward to seeing those of you that can't make the morning class at 6 o'clock on Wednesday night. Y'all have a great week, and we'll see you next week.